Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. Today, I'm so glad to welcome Dr. Steve Zelenkofske, who is a career CMO, I would say, with multiple experiences throughout his career, as well as many board positions along the way. We're going to be talking about what the role of the chief medical officer really entails and alternative models to really bringing that experience and expertise to early stage biotech organizations, especially in the light of recent trends towards the idea of a fractional chief medical officer and what alternative models really exist in the marketplace. Steve, thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here. Really look forward to the conversation.
Maybe to start us off, could you start us talking about your experiences? As I mentioned, you've been a CMO multiple times over. You're an advisor to CMOs. You sit on a number of boards. You've seen this role play out in so many different ways. Talk to us about your experience overall.
Sure, thanks. So I'm a cardiologist by training and joined industry over 25 years ago and started out in large pharma with multiple roles in drug development and launching drugs in a number of successful programs, and then moved over to small biotech about 15 years ago, where I've been a CMO now 5 times, participated in several financings and IPOs, as well as thankfully a bunch of successful INDs and labels and some M&As and some real good exits, and maybe some not so good exits. And about a couple of years ago, transitioned after my 5th role, which was a really great opportunity within gene therapy, but was at the point in my career where I started to act more as an advisor to other CMOs and to boards and to companies. So over the last couple of years, I've been playing a different role and transitioning to the next stage of my career, which has been sitting on the boards, sitting on SABs, and also acting as a consultant to a lot of companies to help them at different stages and help out their CMOs or help out their CEOs in places where the companies are early and don't have a CMO yet, need some medical thought and some clinical thought into their programs. So it's been a nice transition over the last few years, taking advantage of the experiences I've had over the last 25 years in industry.
That's an amazing background, Steve. And it is incredibly rare to see somebody who's had the patience to play the chief medical officer role 5 times over and then continue to advise organization over organization. So I'll say thank you for the entire industry on that front. But what are some of the good, bad, and ugly about the role of the chief medical officer itself? You've seen so many different permutations, but they always look very different and the feel is very different. What are some of the challenges specifically in that role itself?
Sure. And your comment about doing it over and over again, a lot of folks move on to other roles. And I found there's a small group of folks like myself who actually enjoy doing the CMO role. So we found ways to either stay in that role or evolve that role into something that lets us do the things we love to do. And one of the great things about the CMO role is the ability to do a lot of different stuff. And if you're a serial learner and somebody who really enjoys learning new things or applying what you've learned before and learn how to do it better, it couldn't be a better job than the CMO role, because the way I describe it is you almost have to be like an octopus with 8 arms because you've got 8 different jobs, right? There are certain types of CMOs that are out there, and depending upon the role, you almost need to be a chameleon. You need to be able to move from skill set to skill set, depending upon the stage of your company, the behavior of your company, the job you take on, and the role you play within the organization. I think it's critical to have a CMO who really fits the needs of the company and has the ability to evolve with the needs of the company.
That's such a good point. I'd love to dig into it a little bit further about what does it mean to evolve with the needs of the company, and how does somebody who is taking on the chief medical officer role, let's say in a moving into phase 2 stage organization, what are the expectations for them to adapt, and how do they do that?
Well, it's funny because I've been, I had one role where I had 1,200 people globally at a big company reporting into me. And then at two companies, one company I was employee number 9, and the other I was employee number 15. So it really does depend upon the stage of the company. But you asked specifically about phase 2, and it's interesting because on one side, you have to be a partner to the CEO and to the management team to help build the importance of what you're doing, the story, and be able to talk externally. The conversations you have not only with externally with the folks that you're raising money with, but those that help really sell the science you're doing and what you're trying to do for patients. And there's a lot of different stakeholders there. And sometimes the CMO is the only scientific clinical external voice at the table. Sometimes you have the CSO there too, but a lot of times the CEO will bring the CMO with them to really be able to tell that story and evolve that story. So I look at it as, there's the external CMO, that CMO who is really the front face of the organization. But then you have to start thinking about the internal CMO and the one who needs to deliver. And in the environment we're in, it's become even more important, but it's always been important to be able to deliver on the clinical science and be able to deliver data, be able to do it efficiently and smartly, and be able to have the wherewithal to get the right people and be able to set up the right organization to be able to get that job done. It's not an N of one job. And then we forget a lot about the role that the CMO plays in the regulatory process. And that's extremely important. The conversations, not only with the agency, but the cross-play with the regulatory team to be able to make sure that you have the right plan, the right positioning, the correct CDP, and are doing the right stuff to be able to move the process forward. And they all interlink, because if you don't deliver, the story with the investors goes sour pretty quickly, right? And if you can't deliver, if you don't have a regulatory path, then it really doesn't sell externally. And if you can't do the external job, the internal job gets a lot harder. I remember my first CMO role. I left large pharma and I came in, I was employee number 5, and I had all this work to do. And I looked around and I didn't have all the help. And after I, took a wet cloth and put on my face to calm myself down, I got on the phone and called a friend, called my old boss who had left Novartis to become a CMO. And I said to him, tell me about the CMO role. And he said to me, and tell me what the most important hire that I need to have to get started. And he said to me, the role can be summed up as 2 things. He goes, you spend half your time raising money and the other half your time spending the money you just raised. And so that really served me well thinking about it that way.
It's such a good point. And I love the analogy that you brought up of feeling like an octopus when you're in this role. There are so many critical skills that you need in order to be good at the job, whether it's talking to investors or KOLs or driving the science internally or preparing for the regulatory pathway that the organization needs to go down and making sure that you're optimizing the path forward. Given these different multiple times that you've played this role, I imagine it's taken different flavors each time, even though the core components are always the same. When you're in that role, how do you think about those first hires, and how do you supplement the skills around you when it's impossible to juggle all of those things well at any given point in time? How do you make sure, a ball doesn't drop and that you've built the team around you to actually meet those demands?
Well, a common theme I will tell you, and I have a lot of CEO friends and a lot of folks who I've worked for who I've had this discussion with. And a common theme that I've seen with not only with the CMO, but with the CMO team, the medical team, has been that most companies bring their CMO in too late. And when the CMO joins, some of the decisions are made. This is nothing against founders or CSOs, but because most of them, I would say it's rare that I haven't worked with a founder who's not brilliant, and haven't worked with a CSO who's not brilliant. They're all brilliant. They're brilliant scientists. They came up with great ideas, and you join a team because you love the science, and the science has evolved from those brilliant founders. But they're not clinicians. And a lot of times what I've said to folks is there's a science to getting to the science, and then there's an art and a science to take something that is brilliant science and make it into a drug. And that evolution is really, really important, and having somebody early. I find that becomes a problem even with the medical hires, right? Deciding when you need an operations person. I find that having a really strong operational lead is really important early on. Someone who's thinking 5 steps ahead of you to figure out how they're going to get stuff done, and is creating a program that is so well thought out that you build your success before you start. Getting the right consultants, whether it be regulatory or pharmacology or whatever you need, needs to be driven as a thought process where you really have a thought roadmap before you get started. And that's really why hiring the CMO early is important. It's about thinking when you're in a mouse, how that fits into a human, and thinking about with the end in sight before you get started. So knowing where you're going, you don't get in the car and put the next stop in your GPS. You get in the car and you put where you're going into the GPS, and all the steps along the way are there. And if the GPS sees traffic, it reroutes you. And that's what you do. That's how you run your program. You really need to think about the end in mind at the beginning.
Absolutely. I very much appreciate that point. I love the GPS analogy, but I even very much appreciate your earlier point on it. There's a science to getting to the science, but an art and a science to turning it into a drug. That is amazing and a great way to think about what we need to do to get drugs into clinic and to prove that they really work for the patients who are going to ultimately benefit from all of the work that gets put in. Steve, you started to talk about bringing the CMO role in earlier. A lot of early stage organizations are very hesitant to do that, whether it's because of financing or just not feeling like there's enough work to really necessitate that full-time hire and bringing in that voice. We're seeing a huge trend toward the idea of fractional chief medical officers, which can be a huge asset to a lot of organizations, but there's a lot of challenges, in my opinion, largely due to the definition of what a fractional chief medical officer actually is and how it's going to be applied in an organization, or what the expectations are relative to that octopus analogy. They can't be all of the things in 10 hours a week. And so can you talk to me about how you've seen that fractional CMO role play out in the conversations you're having around organizations considering bringing those roles in?
Yeah, and it's been more common lately. It's almost been the more the norm that folks are looking for fractionals rather than FTEs. And I think the financing environment, the survival environment where companies are right now in that spectrum of being able to stay alive is driving this. And the desire for smaller leadership teams and less spend on your LT and less dilution on or giving away equity and those kind of things early has driven some of this for protection of the company long term to get off the ground. So there is an inertia there and a reason to do this. But I think one of the things that it does is it actually puts a lot more pressure on the company to understand what they need, when they need it, and how they need it, and to be able to understand their roles and their needs. Really important. One of the things that I was going to say is that there's another reason to bring somebody on early besides thinking about how your mouse study evolves into a human study, which evolves into a successful program and plans that out. And that is the chemistry between the CMO and the CEO is extremely important. The chemistry between the CEO and the CSO, or the head of R&D, is unbelievably important. You need to be able to challenge each other. You need to be able to interact with each other and be thought partners. But we live in a world of science. We know that things don't always go right. As a matter of fact, most of the times they don't go the way we plan them. We have to have those tough conversations along the way and challenge each other. And when you do that off the bat, it gets somewhat hard. But as you get to know each other and build that chemistry, it's almost expected. And so that's another reason to bring somebody in early. But we talked about that octopus, and it's really, really hard to get one person who's really good at 8 things. And some folks are really good at being that external CMO, and some are really good at operations and delivery, and some are good at really being a clinical strategist, and some are great at translational science, right? And then you've got the rare ones who are good at everything. And if you get someone like that, then, they still need help. But if you don't know what you need and you get the wrong one, having somebody who's there part-time, it makes it even worse, right? So if they're there full-time and they're learning on the job and they figure out what you need and they go get the help, that's one thing. But when you hire a piece of somebody and they come in and they're the wrong fit, that really is a disaster. But a lot of times you don't need one thing. You need a lot of stuff. And that makes it hard when you get a piece of somebody. And it's even more important that the fit is right and the understanding is right and the design of how you use them is right.
So how does an organization at this early stage balance the need for these critical skills and this leadership medical voice with the fact that one person probably won't fit the bill, but they know they need that senior leader at the table in order to drive the larger strategic decisions? How should an organization think about that today, understanding the financing constraints, understanding that everyone's rushing to get to the next milestone as quickly as possible? It's a tough balance. And I know executives across the industry are struggling with that.
Yeah, no. And I will tell you, even in places where I've been in an FTE CMO, I always struggle to try to convince folks to hire the folks I need. There's a lack of understanding what the clinical organization really needs internally versus what they're renting, like a CRO externally, and what that alignment is and how you do that, how you align, the oversight and thought leadership you need internally, and what you need to own as an organization. I've always said that, even organizations that are fully outsourced, you need some internal people because the company needs to own their own activities. And when you hand off your activities to vendors, sometimes you get great outcomes, sometimes you don't. And in the CRO model, we can get into that on a completely different podcast, but the CRO model, I think in a lot of ways doesn't work for these small companies because of that. Not that they're not good. It's just not, it's about ownership, right? But to get back to the question you put there, I think assuming that, getting a really good CMO, even if that person is a really great octopus, is going to work out if you hire them 50 or 20 or 30% of the time is going to be the equivalent of just getting a piece of somebody who's really, really good and be able to do all these things you need them to do is probably not the right assumption, right? And so I really think we need to think differently about how we do that. And what we need to do is find somebody who can be the thought partner that you need, and maybe that external or that, that what we used to say in the OR is, the captain of the ship was the operating. When I did cases, I was always the captain of the ship, but I had a team around me. And, you don't need to hire these people full time, but, thinking about the fractional CMO as a team, I think is a lot more, has a higher chance of success than bringing in one person and expecting them to be an octopus and dividing their 8 arms by a third or a quarter each time and getting like a piece of something you need that's really, really good. So, and I think the other piece that's missing is sitting down with that CMO and maybe a project manager and figuring out exactly what pieces of that octopus you need and how you need to do it. But really thinking about the fungibility of, well, maybe you don't get a 50% CMO. Maybe you get the CMO a little bit less, but he's leading or she's leading a team of folks who fill in that 50%, but you get a whole bunch of skill sets and you still get that octopus and you still get a fractional a fractional cost, and you meet your financial needs, but you get a whole lot more output and it's a whole lot more efficient.
So to summarize that, which I think is incredibly profound for our industry, is to shift the paradigm from a fractional CMO as a single person to a fractional CMO as actually a tiger team, if you will, that takes on the various legs. I'm going to continue to come back to this octopus model, but there's, if every leg is a different skill set, it's a small team that really is playing that fractional chief medical officer role. But it's not officer, it's office in some capacity. And you're leaning on that team to deliver against the external engagement, the internal clinical strategy, the early translational, the KOL engagement, whatever it might be. But there's various skills brought to the table that's essentially adding up to the sum of that fractional CMO so that you're optimizing the various skills.
Yeah, and I like the idea of a CMO office anyway, right? Because I think the CMO really needs to have the right organization around them to be successful. But I think in this case, thinking the CMO as an entity and that fractional CMO as an entity, which serves, and a lot of folks will say, well, then, if it's an entity, then I don't have the person I can put on my website to be my interim, or I don't have the person I can put in front of investors. Well, actually, it works out well, because if you have an entity that can get the operational stuff done and you need the CMO to, get you to pre-IND early, or get you to an IND, or get you to a first patient in a study in phase 1 or phase 2, having the structure underneath them so that they can oversee that and be responsible for it fractionally, but not have to get on the ground to do that work. They can spend a little bit more time working on your external facing roles as well when you only have them a piece at a time. So really thinking about what that need is and thinking about it as an office or an entity is probably a better way to do this and get more bang for the buck, so to speak, especially in a tight financing environment.
Absolutely. I want to shift gears a little bit relative to this kind of skill arbitrage play. How do you think about the various skills that need to be brought to the table? We talked about clinical operations, we talked about translational, we talked about some of the external engagement pieces. We've been seeing a bit of a trend towards more organizations either fully staffing or bringing on chiefs of staff for the chief medical officer, or somebody in that program operations type role that's really the handshake to the CMO. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing on that end and what you think makes somebody successful in partnering with the CMO relative to those needs?
Yeah, I like that approach of having somebody on board who's the second level person who really is taking on the day-to-day operational and organizational planning. I will tell you that although I've done everything and I consider myself pretty decent at doing stuff, there are things that I know that I'm really good and really bad at. If I were to sit down and dig into stuff and get detail, I can get very detail oriented, but it's not my strongest skill set is to sit down and organize things and pay attention to individual details and that kind of thing, and really drive operational details like that. And part of that is the fact that I found that as I've evolved in these roles, I'm taking on more and more and more stuff, and I have less and less time to do that stuff. And so having someone underneath me who's really driving that is really important. One of the things that was a trend for a while was, and I find this in some organizations, they're still doing this, is they will either get the COO or somebody in the CEO suite to start mixing into some of the delivery and operations stuff. I think because execution has become so important, and it always has been, but even more so now when getting the clinical data is the milestone all the investors want to see. But the problem, and it's funny because I find that a lot of people think they can do what the operations roles and the CMO roles are when they've never done those roles before, just because they're really good operational folks. And some of them can, but it's a whole lot different skill set running clinical trial programs and delivering on clinical trials and designing clinical trials and doing it. And what I find is that you almost always win the game before you start or lose the game before you start. It's around, what does your protocol look like? What does your operations look like? What do your planning look like? Have you thought about all the contingencies, and have you put in all the right steps before you start? And when you have to fix things, and in particular in clinical trial work, I find that when you have to go in and fix things when it's not going right, it costs you a whole lot more, and it never works as well as it should have when you didn't do it right the first time. And knowing and having done it should never be underestimated. And just because you're an operational person and can run a company and can run operations in a business doesn't mean that you can, or even run operations on the CMC side doesn't mean you can run it on the clinical side. So I think having clinical specialists who know what needs to be delivered on a development program, know what needs to be delivered on a clinical program, know what needs to be delivered on a biomarker program or a companion device or companion diagnostics program is extremely important, because of the fact that they know what to anticipate. They know what hiccups have occurred in the past, and they've learned from them, and they get you off to a much smoother start, which makes your finish a whole lot easier. So I like the idea about having a chief of staff who has that experience and can think across all of these execution plays and get ahead of them, and really pay attention. Be the I guess it's the yin to the yang, or whatever it is, with the CMO.
Absolutely. I think there's a really important need to pull the various disciplines and functions together and ask some of the hard questions that internally, when you're so heads down, focused on what needs to happen today and tomorrow, it's hard to take that step back and say, are we doing the right thing? Are we really driving towards that larger outcome that the organization is trying to achieve, and what's the path to get there. So couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and I think the other point you make is about having challenging thought leadership underneath you who comes in and will, close the door and say, you're wrong. And this is why I think you're wrong. Or here, we got a problem. And this is what's going on. This is what we want to do about it. It's okay. And what do you think? And I've always invited that. I think having folks on your team who challenge you, who think independently, who come in with problems with solutions is unbelievably important. And I think that works for everything. But in particular, when you're only part-time and you're fractional, it's even more important to have folks who have, eyes on the ground, right?
Absolutely. Having those people who are going to push the needle and then not be afraid of the repercussions of saying what needs to be said. It is incredibly hard to build a culture that enables that, but the earlier you can do it, the better the outcome is going to be across the organization.
For sure.
Steve, this has been an incredible conversation. In my mind, I'm going to continue to come back to this octopus analogy. I think we all need t-shirts. We'll see them at the CMO Summit. Everyone's going to be wearing an octopus t-shirt or have a stuffed animal. But it's certainly a very challenging role, especially when we're thinking about the fractional positioning of a chief medical officer. And I think you gave a lot of really great ideas on ways to make it incredibly successful. So appreciate all of your insights and looking forward to having you back on the show another time soon.
Great. Thank you. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.